40 years ago this month, in April 1975, the Vietnamese registered the only military victory against the United States in the entire history of the American empire. The victory of the Vietnamese came after decades of war and suffering. And when one looks back at the situation today in Vietnam, you can still meet people whose parents and grandparents were subjected to napalm, to Agent Orange, to chemical weapons of the most destructive sort, where diseases laid low many sections of the Vietnamese population. It's common in the West to usually discuss the effect of the war on the United States, on its Marines, on its pilots who dropped bombs, but to underplay the impact the war had on the Vietnamese people itself. I was in Vietnam at the height of the war, from December 66 to January 1967. For 6 to 7 weeks, I traveled through North Vietnam under cover of darkness, because we couldn't travel during the day since anything that moved, seen from the air, was bombed. And those 6 weeks in Vietnam had a profound impact on my life, on my politics, on my consciousness. It was an experience I could never forget, and it remains vivid to this day. Why was this war fought in the first place? The answer is very simple. The United States, made extremely nervous by the victory of the Chinese Revolution in 1949, became obsessed by a theory that they described as the dominoes theory. China had gone. If they didn't stop the revolution on the Chinese borders, it would spread to Southeast Asia, possibly beyond, and therefore any manifestation of nationalism, of communism, of independence, of sovereignty had to be crushed. The Vietnamese had been fighting for independence under the French for many years. Then they fought the Japanese, who replaced the French during the Second World War. After the Japanese were defeated, the British came in briefly into Vietnam to hold it while the French came back, and they held it with defeated Japanese troops. So the British General Douglas Gracey occupied Vietnam with the help of Japanese troops who'd committed many an atrocity in that land, waiting for the French troops to return and reoccupy Vietnam, which they did. So from 1945 onwards, Vietnam was engulfed in wars. Attempted declarations of independence by the Vietnamese leadership under Ho Chi Minh, where he proclaimed a democratic republic of Vietnam and promised free elections would be held, came to naught because the French were not interested in negotiating. In Fontainebleau in Paris, outside Paris in 1946, there was a conference on Vietnam, but no agreement was reached. The war continued. And then, in 1954, the French suffered a bruising defeat in a small town called Dien Bien Phu in North Vietnam. And they never recovered from the defeat. The French, like their American successors, had been racist, contemptuous of the people they were fighting, had described one of the most brilliant generals in the Vietnamese resistance, General Vo Nguyen Giap, as a Bush general. These were bush people. These were people beneath our contempt. We were superior beings. That is what the Western colonial mind was taught to think, and that is how many French officers thought. They simply did not believe that they could be outmaneuvered militarily and strategically by a Vietnamese resistance army with limited weaponry and defeated. But the siege of Dien Bien Phu went on till the French were defeated and the French army surrendered. Their leading officers, 2 of them, committed suicide rather than surrender to these inferior beings. That's how deep the colonial racism went. And after Dien Bien Phu, once again, there was a conference. The communists proposed a unified Vietnam, and in Geneva, in that same year, it was agreed there would be free elections within 2 years, and that the results of the elections would be respected by all sides. The United States opposed the elections. The American President Eisenhower said, all our information indicates that were there a free election in Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh and the communists would win an overwhelming majority of the vote, and hence no elections were held. Instead, the French were gradually replaced by the United States. By 1960, the United States had what they called advisors, but in other words, soldiers already in South Vietnam fighting with the weak South Vietnamese army. And this was the 3rd phase of the war in Vietnam, a war which had been going on already now for 3 decades. This last phase of the war was the most cruel, because the military power of the United States was unmatched, and they bombarded that country. The figures are quite astonishing, provided in a number of books. In a new book on the Vietnam War, Nick Turse, an investigative journalist and historian, the book is titled Kill Anything That Moves, The Real American War in Vietnam, describes, on average, between 1965 and 1968, 32 tons of bombs per hour were dropped on the North. It turned out, however, that of the munitions unleashed by the United States during the Vietnam War, added up to the equivalent of 640 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs. The lion's share were dropped not on the North, but on South Vietnam, where 19 million people were subjected to the most lopsided air war ever fought. The guerrillas of South Vietnam, the resistance, had no air force at all. North Vietnam's modest air force fought a purely defensive battle. Unchallenged except by ground fire, the United States carried out the most intense bombing campaign in history. And added to this was regular daily acts of torture, brutality, and barbarity, which Nick Turse brings back to us in his book. And we heard about these when we were in Vietnam. The Vietnamese would tell us stories virtually every single week of a new atrocity that had been carried out. What were these atrocities? Burning villages. Why? To try and prevent the population of the South from linking up with the North. And in order to do this, they separated villages regarded as unfriendly. They were called strategic hamlets. They were sealed off from the rest of the population. Many villages were just burnt, literally burnt. And there's the famous remark of an American officer who had been in charge of destroying one such village, the village of Ben Tre. He said the only way to save the village was to destroy it. And in that single sentence was expressed the essence of US policy in Vietnam. I was reminded of all this during the Iraq War, when stories began to leak out and later documentary evidence of the tortures being inflicted on political prisoners and prisoners of war in Iraq, in the Abu Ghraib prison. The rapes that took place, what women were compelled to do, all this shocked people. And I remember thinking at the time, what a pity it is that the people of the United States forget their own history so quickly. Because the tortures in Iraq, horrific though they were on a lesser scale than what had happened in Vietnam. And I remember very well a conference in Chicago on Iraq, where people were saying, in a nice, well-meaning way, that the tortures were just shocking. And an American Marine who had fought in Vietnam got up from the floor of the House and said, if you find this shocking, which it is, you don't know what happened when I was in Vietnam. And he described how prisoners were treated. And he said, in pin-drop silence in the hall, he said, we captured, just to give you one example, we captured 2 Viet Cong prisoners, i.e. communist prisoners. We wanted to get from them knowledge as to whether the rest of their team was in that area. They said no, they refused to speak. We disemboweled one and said to the other, this is what will happen to you unless you talk too. And he said this was common practice, the tortures we carried out. Often, he said, we would outsource the tortures to the local troops who were fighting with us. And on our orders, they carried out even more grisly and grotesque tortures on the Vietnamese who were fighting against us. But still they couldn't win. And that is now, and 45 years later, one thinks back on that war. What is staggering is that despite all this, despite the bombing, despite the killing, despite the torture, despite the rapes, the Vietnamese carried on. And ultimately, the United States could no longer fight in that war. This is where Nick Turse's book offers much valuable material, which he recounts in terms of the growing worries amongst American officers that their troops were simply not going to fight anymore. In 1971, in the Armed Forces Journal of the United States, Colonel Robert Heinel wrote as follows: the morale, discipline, and battle worthiness of the US Armed Forces are, with a few salient exceptions, lower and worse than at any time in this century, and possibly in the history of the United States. By every conceivable indicator, our army that now remains in Vietnam is in a state approaching collapse, with individual units avoiding or having refused combat, murdering their officers and non-commissioned officers, drug-ridden and dispirited where not near mutinous. Now, this account by an American officer of the state within the American Armed Forces was crucial, because it was even worse than he described. Essentially, there were mutinies inside the American army, sometimes mutinies carried out by black soldiers who found the racism unbearable. sometimes fights between black and white soldiers, sometimes united actions by black and white soldiers against their officers, simple disregard of military instructions, officers being shot in the back by their own troops. This was an extremely important part in the victory of 40 years ago in April 1975. This, combined with the eruption of an anti-war movement all over the world, but in the United States itself. What was this anti-war movement? It was a movement which affected the entire country because the American army was effectively recruited through conscription. Every single family, if they had a son, because women were not allowed in the army in those days, if they had a son of military age, he had to go into combat. Of course, the very rich and privileged managed to get their sons out. Many people fled rather than serve in a war they didn't believe in, went to Canada, Sweden, France, Germany, to avoid the draft. But the draft affected everyone. And this meant that at every single breakfast table in most parts of the United States, in the homes of middle class and working class and all other social classes, people discussed the war. Why are we here? Are we winning it? And it became clear they were not winning it. And the people who were the clearest about that were the soldiers fighting in Vietnam itself. They knew they could never win the war. Every single year from '66 onwards, the American generals would say, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. In fact, they were not getting anywhere. They were killing, they were killing, they were killing, but they were not winning. And it was ultimately the realization that they could not win the war that created a huge anti-war movement. And for the first time in the history of the United States, this anti-war movement grew inside the American army itself. Veterans in 1971 marched in Washington outside the Pentagon and the White House. One of the most astonishing and inspiring demonstrations in the history of the United States, where not only did they say they were not going to fight, they threw their medals. These were soldiers without legs, without arms, cripples, people walking on crutches, with the most decorated, some of them were the most decorated soldiers of the war, coming to Washington and throwing their medals away, some of them hurling them at the Pentagon, some of them at the White House. It's a moment which it's difficult to imagine. So you had a war on two fronts. One war was taking place on the battlefield in Vietnam, where the Vietnamese were winning every single month. They were winning despite the heavy bombardments. And the other war was taking place in the very heart of the United States itself. And the combination of these two, the loss of morale, the knowledge that they could not win the war, that they might lose it, began to create panic in Washington. The last spring offensive of the Vietnamese revolutionaries, the resistance fighters, captured the American embassy, more or less, came close to the American embassy. And those images, which were iconic for decades afterwards, of American helicopters lifting their people from outside the United States embassy, people clinging onto them as they left the Saigon embassy of the United States of America forever. Soon afterwards, in came the Vietnamese resistance armies and took that embassy and the city as well. And the Vietnamese had always realized that they would ultimately win the war, but the cost was heavy. And books written in the United States naturally talk largely about the impact on America, but the impact on Vietnam was appalling. The social infrastructure of the South had been destroyed, Vietnam had been bombed, so badly that hardly buildings in some cities were left standing. Much had to be done. The effects of chemical weapons had left a lasting mark on that country. Forests had been destroyed. It was a horrific war, but nonetheless, they won. Now, the United States was shattered. No doubt about it, that the 75 defeat in Vietnam shook them. They recovered, finally. This is something that is not often talked about these days, but that war created a mood of solidarity in Africa, in South Africa, and in the Portuguese colonies, where reports which came out later showed that guerrillas in Mozambique, Angola, Guinea, fighting against the Portuguese colonial occupiers, were listening on their weak transistor radios for news from Vietnam. And every Vietnamese triumph, every Vietnamese victory was celebrated in the battlefields of colonial Africa as well. Not simply there, the impact on Latin America of this war had been great. So this was a war fought in Southeast Asia that inspired people throughout the whole world. And it was not till much later that a true picture emerged of what had actually happened in Vietnam itself. Now, American policy always, from the day that the United States replaced the European empires as the world's policeman and the world's conqueror, American foreign policy has always been determined by one issue, which is how to preserve and expand US power and hegemony in the world. The wars they fought in Korea in the 50s, in Vietnam in the 60s, were designed for that purpose. Unable to attack China, they had finally to make friends with China and divide the communist movement, which was a far more clever operation than waging wars. The Americans thought of the whole communist world as a monolith, and yet it wasn't. They had divisions. There were divisions between the Chinese and the Russians, divisions between the Chinese and the Vietnamese, divisions between the Vietnamese and the Russians. They were not a monolith. They were different countries. And ultimately, the United States recognized that and began to move more adroitly, if the truth be told, by detaching China from that whole world and then using it first to weaken the Russians and secondly to fight the Vietnamese. One of the worst outcomes of that war was the attempt by the Chinese trying to curry favor with the United States to punish the Vietnamese. We will destroy the myth of Vietnamese invincibility, said Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader. They didn't. They couldn't win. Many Chinese and Vietnamese soldiers died unnecessarily in what was power politics at its worst. Then the Americans, trying to put more pressure on the Vietnamese, had bombed Cambodia into the Stone Age virtually. And that produced monsters of a different type, the Pol Pot regime, and what it did. And this regime was then used both by the Americans and the Chinese to go after the Vietnamese long after the defeat of 1975. So they didn't totally give up. And it was a Cambodian provocation backed by the Chinese against Vietnam that finally forced the Vietnamese to intervene and get rid of Pol Pot, for which they were attacked. Pol Pot's representatives were permitted by the West to stay on in the United Nations for 12 whole years after the defeat of Pol Pot. Compare that to the speed with which the Iraqi representatives of the old regime were removed by the United States once they'd occupied and taken Baghdad. So imperial policy displays a certain consistency. And that consistency is based on imperial needs. There are no principles involved at all. In recent years, human rights have become a pillar of the Western offensive against people they consider their enemies. But if you look at the wars they fought in the 50s and 60s and 70s in Asia and Africa, human rights were the one thing that was never mentioned. It was, in the end, revealing that what scared the United States the most was not the Vietnamese, whom they had consistently underestimated and treated with contempt like the French before them, but the mutiny and rebellions of their own soldiers. A group called Veterans for Peace, these were soldiers who'd fought in Vietnam, played a crucial part in that campaign. And one of the veterans groups used to distribute leaflets both to serving soldiers outside US military bases and to American citizens at large. And this is what one of the leaflets said. A US infantry company just came through here. If you had been Vietnamese, we might have burned your house, we might have shot your dog, we might have shot you, we might have raped your wife and daughter, we might have turned you over to your government for torture, we might have taken souvenirs from your property, we might have shot things up a bit, we might have done all these things to you and your whole town. If it doesn't bother you that American soldiers do these things every day to the Vietnamese simply because they are gooks, then picture yourselves as one of the silent victims. But picturing themselves as one of the silent victims is difficult to do today. It was easier during the Vietnam War because so many ordinary Americans had fought. And we now know that some of the talks that they were given before they went into Iraq were very similar in tone, contemptuous towards the Arabs, abusive language, racist language, to get soldiers psychologically accustomed to killings, that these are not human beings like us. They are uncivilized. They have an uncivilized religion. So what we are doing is absolutely necessary. The great German philosopher who committed suicide to prevent capture by the Nazis, Walter Benjamin, once wrote that there is no document of civilization that is not at the same time a document of barbarism. The war in Vietnam proved that, if any proof was needed. The wars taking place in the Arab world today prove it even more. So civilizational arguments do not work as long as empires last, because the preservation of that empire and its interests and its allies is the only issue that is at stake for the imperial rulers, the imperial bureaucracy, and the imperial army. The war they fought in Vietnam against a communist enemy was fought with a brutality that was exceptional. They wanted to inflict a defeat. Instead, they were defeated. And yet, today, Vietnam, like China, has opened its doors to private capital. A great deal of exploitation takes place. Capitalism, especially from the United States, but not exclusively, firms, capitalist firms, multinationals, are in Vietnam making profits. And many Vietnamese now ask, if this is what was going to happen, what the hell did we fight for anyway?